Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gathaithi AB wash processed Kenya from the Picky Chemist. And there's the bag right there. And the Picky Chemist, based out of Chaudfontaine, Belgium, and their coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, as they've quickly become one of our most featured European coffee roasters on this channel. We picked this coffee up from Airworks as part of one of their special releases, and I originally didn't plan on reviewing this coffee given that it doesn't really sound like my type of coffee. However, after I saw how much excitement there was for its release, I decided to pick it up anyway. So it'll be interesting to see how it's turned out, as this right here is day 63. And recipe we went with for this coffee was the Picky Chemist's recipe, which is a 15.83 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 92 degrees Celsius, about 197 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe once upon a time the Picky Chemist actually used to have a different profile for their coffees, as I think their lightest coffee was considered to be a filter roast. I think since then they've now changed it to being an ultra light, as this one right here is on the ultra light roast of their profile. That being said, it still is consistent with our previous experiences with this coffee roaster, which is on the extremely light side of things, as they still are one of the lightest roasting coffee roasters in the entirety of the world. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 31, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was slightly subdued off that first try, though it does offer a pretty lingering sense to it. There's a slightly sweeter red fruit that's perhaps along the lines of the listed tomato in a slightly sweeter sense. So the main reason why this coffee didn't really sound like my type of coffee was because they had an interesting tomato leaf descriptor for this coffee. And even then, I'd heard some kind of mixed impressions early on from people that received this coffee before its release. And I'd heard that it can be at times a little tomato-like, but for me, I wasn't entirely sure if that's something we could expect. And it was somewhat present this first time around, but it didn't really have too much of a tomato-like component outside of that. Once again, just a little bit more sweeter in that sense, but outside of that, a very slight spiced quality to it to go along with that lingering citrus, which was the very lingering feel within this coffee. So I would say a interesting first impression along the lines of what I might have expected for this coffee roaster and this type of coffee. Day 35 through the Chemex, and the results were much more mixed today, as it did offer better intensity but also more tomato as a result. So there was a bit more of the expected red herbal qualities to it, as the previously mentioned spice aspects were present once again. In addition to that, the finish does have plenty of the listed lime, as the coffee definitely felt like it was opening off this second impression. Day 38 through the April brewer, and the coffee was better today, as it feels like there's a bit less of the red fruit tomato-like characteristics relative to some of the previous days. There is a bit more of a sugary sweetness that's in line with a vanilla-like aspect to this coffee, which in itself was kind of interesting. Not something that I would say was overly present or prominent throughout the entirety of this one, but on this day felt a little bit more of that within it. In addition to that, plenty of brightness and intensity, as it's above average in terms of the intensity relative to a lot of the other coffees we've had from the Picky Chemist. I should say maybe some more of their standard offerings, so in that aspect I would say it was a better impression this time around. Day 44 through the V60 with the Picky Chemist recipe, and it was very interesting that the overall intensity of this coffee has greatly opened up, as it's skewing much more in the direction of the flavor profile, not in line with my own preferences. So it did feel a fair bit more Kenyan savory like this time around, with much more of the tomato and a strong lime brightness to it. So once again, those were a lot of the descriptors and notes within this coffee that I said, this really does not sound like my type of Kenyan coffee, and much to, well, I shouldn't say my surprise, exactly what I was expecting. This coffee did seem to skew very much in that direction, especially on this day. All presented with a very lingering, long-lasting herbal sense. So all of these qualities are qualities that I don't necessarily enjoy within Kenyan coffees, though I do know they are a massive selling point to others. Day 47 through the Chemex with the Picky Chemist recipe, and it wasn't quite as intense and pronounced as compared to the previous day, but it also has less of the tomato-like aspects as a result, which definitely did seem to help out for me. A nice level of soft, sugary sweetness to go with a mostly red-themed, but delicate red-themed experience. Plenty of herbality, once again, so still offering plenty of Kenyan-like characteristics, but a little bit more subdued this time around. Day 50. through the V60 with the Picky Chemist recipe, and the coffee does continue to remain pretty consistent as it's all presented in a delicate but relatively intense sense, with these savory aspects being present but not quite as abundant, and this time around I would say much more of the citric qualities to it. Day 53 through the Chemex with the Picky Chemist recipe, and this was the best the coffee had been to this point, as it was presenting a little bit more intensity and sweetness to it with less of the savory red qualities to the coffee. Still herbal and bright, but better balanced with the sweetness, as the citrus has become a bit more abundant as a result. So I would say that it's a trade-off I was happily willing to make. A little bit more citric qualities than the savory red fruit aspects to it is something that I will happily take, especially when it comes to a coffee like this. So on day 56, final notes we have through the Chemex with the Picky Chemist recipe, and it's the best it had been to this point, as I do feel like this coffee has been improving incrementally each time we brew it, offering a classic Kenyan profile with a combination of bright red berries, red florality, savory red qualities, citric lime that remains prominent throughout, with plenty of sugariness as well, so a lot of positives to take away on this final day. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And interestingly enough, the Picky Chemist has started including their own tasting wheels with their coffees. So I'm actually going to compare it alongside of their tasting wheel, and I won't display it given that it is property of the Picky Chemist, but I'm going to kind of go through some of the things side by side, because we did get some different, we'll say, different scores for a lot of these categories. But let's go ahead and start with the cleanliness level 4, and that's always going to be a positive when it comes to Kenyan coffees for me, because if there is too much of these strong savory red fruit qualities to it, then that can hinder the overall experience for a Kenyan coffee for me. But even though there was a fair bit of savoriness to it, it didn't hinder the overall cleanliness, as I did find this coffee to be pretty well defined, pretty clean, and pretty direct when it comes to the profile within this coffee. So level 4 is where we opted to put it. Glancing quickly, and I think the only thing that could kind of be in line with that is that they have a fermentiness in their tasting wheel, and that's on the lower side of things, so I guess that works out. Let's go ahead and move on. Finish level 4, and the finish is a classic Kenyan-like finish to it, an abundance of those Kenyan qualities. So I would have to say that it was the citric lime that did feel the most abundant and prominent within the finish of this coffee, and that's in line with their own experiences, as they did have the citric fruit in this one to be pretty high on their own tasting wheel. Sweetness level 4, that's probably the biggest selling point to me on this coffee. As I mentioned, it's not my type of coffee going into it, but it will be a lot more in line with my preferences if the sweetness is as high as it is. They do have a level 4 for the sweetness from them, and I can completely agree with that, as I did find this to be sweeter than the average coffee that we've had from them in the past, at least as far as their standard offerings go. Acidity, level 4. Yeah, there's plenty of the Kenyan-like brightness, and I always say if the Kenyan coffees don't score a level 4 for brightness, then something went really wrong, but at the same time, they have a level 4 for the acidity as well. It's going to be kind of interesting discussing the acidity with one of the other coffees that we are reviewing from the Picky Chemist, as they did seem to have it higher than they did for these Kenyan coffees. Florality, level 4. And I'm taking a very quick glance. I'm not sure if they have a floral note in their own tasting wheel, but as far as it goes for me, it did have plenty of the red floral qualities to it. They do have a rhubarb note listed on here as well, which I can see. But once again, it's a lot of those classic Kenyan characteristics to it, presented in that more delicate, subdued sense. So florals did score pretty high for me. This is the most interesting one for me in this tasting wheel, as the berry fruits did score a level 4 for us. They have the berry fruit all the way down, I want to say, where did they have it listed? Okay, there we go. The florals, they have pretty low. They have the florals at a level 2, and then they have the red fruits at a level 2, which are two things that I very much disagree with. I scored level 4s for both of those, and I'm not sure how we perceive them or what the difference is regarding these coffees, but for me, both of those are classic in terms of the Kenyan profile to them. Both of them were scoring pretty high for us as far as the berry fruits go, so I definitely felt a fair bit of those more classic tart currant qualities to it, so level 4 is where we opted to put it. Citrus fruit also there at the level 4, and that's something that we definitely agreed on. I think it's the highest scoring thing they have on their own tasting wheel alongside of the sweetness, so completely agree with that. Let's go ahead and move on to the couple of level 3s that we do have. Spice, level 3. As mentioned, there's definitely a little bit of an herbal spiced quality to it. They also did have that pretty high within their own tasting wheel. And that was one of the, I would say, more different characteristics about this coffee compared to other Kenyans in the past, as this one did feel a little bit more herbal in that regard. In addition to that, The savoriness is there at the level 3, and I wouldn't necessarily say that that's all tomato. I think it's a little bit more of that herbal savory quality to it, so it's not something that would hinder the overall cleanliness of it, because I did get some slight tomato at times. I would say that it was amplified a little bit more with the V60, so having that quality toned down the more we worked with this coffee did seem to help for me, as that's not a characteristic that I usually look for too much with in a coffee. And then the final thing worth discussing is the body at a level 3, and they do have the texture on theirs to be pretty high as well, but that's certainly fully expected given that this is, of course, a Kenyan coffee, and even with the Chemex, it did score plenty of body and texture to it. So we are in agreement on that. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee, but it's definitely very interesting for me that they had both the florals and red fruit scoring there at that level 2 mark. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I said going into it that this one is certainly not my type of coffee, but by the end I actually did find myself enjoying it probably a fair bit more than I might have expected going into it. At the end of the day though, it still certainly isn't my type of coffee, but as far as it goes compared to the majority of the Picky Chemist standard offerings that we've had in the past, I actually liked it, I would say, more than the majority of them, given that this one just felt a little easier to brew. I was able to get some better intensity from it, some better sweetness for it, and for all of those reasons, I definitely have to say that it was on the better end of things relative to the standard offerings that we have had from this coffee roaster. So credit to them. I genuinely don't know if their coffees have gotten easier to brew, but I would love to hear from you guys, as there's so many more people that have a lot more familiarity with this coffee roaster than I do. I just genuinely found not this one, but all of the other ones that we're going to be discussing to be significantly easier to brew than they had been in the past. The type of person that I would suggest this coffee to, I feel like there is a very specific type of Kenyan drinker that does like this type of Kenyan coffee. And I've heard that you either like this one or the Kaganda, which is going to be the next coffee from the Picky Chemist that we're reviewing a little bit more, as they did seem to offer two different sides of the Kenyan spectrum, as one of them was perhaps a little bit more fruit forward, where the other one was a little bit more herbal, kind of red fruit, savory forward. And this one was that type of Kenyan coffee that isn't my type of Kenyan coffee. But for somebody that does like a little bit more of those kind of herbal, we'll say savory red fruit qualities, then this one's probably going to be a better fit for you. I think that's what sold a lot of people on this one originally, and it definitely offered that in abundance and a much more clean and sweet representation of that as well. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gathaithi AB Wash Process Kenya from the Picky Chemist. Thank you for watching.